Welcome to Less Hustle, More Happy. I'm your host, Dana. And each week I will be interviewing awesome humans who are making meaningful shifts within their lives and the world around them on this podcast. And I want to welcome to the show Rachel Nelson. She is a certified death doula and grief educator, owner of Roots to Wings. And I've known Rachel for maybe 15 years. Since I think your mid-20s.
I think so.
I've come out to the Vail area and stayed with you before when I was still living in Wisconsin. And I've loved just, watching your journey online and have this deep respect and awe on the person who you have transformed into through this ridiculously, challenging, trying journey at times. But I would love for you just to, share, if you're comfortable with it, a little bit about how you came to be a death doula.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dana. It's so wonderful to connect like this, after all the years. My journey is kind of a long one, and I'll just give the shorter synopsis. But my journey with grief and death work, honestly, I feel like it actually started when I was young. I remember when I was in kindergarten, my babysitter, I had a babysitter down the street. She died by suicide. And that was kind of my first introduction to grief and loss and things like that. And it feels like it's just kind of been part of my life for most of my life. But the thing that really the two things that spurred me into wanting to do more of this work was the death of my best friend in 2015. Not 2015, I'm sorry, 2005.
Okay.
And then my first son was stillborn in 2015. So those were kind of my two biggest losses that moved me to this work.
Mm-hmm.
So now, and I've gone through a lot. I was a yoga studio owner, and after my first son died, I shifted away from that. I still teach yoga a little bit here and there, but that really, losing a child is not something I want anyone to ever experience. However, it is something people experience over their lives, and it changes how you see the world. It changes who you feel like you are, and it shifted a lot of where I, moved into different areas of my life, moved me towards wanting to do more grief work and grief education, and then eventually becoming a death doula. So that's kind of the shortness of it.
And most people want to run away from their pain. And you almost ran towards it with pursuing these trainings, these certifications of, how can you also help people go through this journey, go through this experience that you went through? Did you have anybody when you went through the loss of your first son, people in this kind of realm of a death doula, grief educator that you could turn to? Or did you feel really alone through that?
I didn't. It didn't feel like it was it's not that long ago, but even in 2015, it didn't feel like it was something people were talking about, were doing, were offering. It was you either go to therapy. All I could find was and even then, a lot of therapists don't specialize in grief, or especially stillbirth or child loss. I couldn't find anyone that had either education or background in that. And I found support groups, but a lot of them were very religious based, which is, I have no problem with that, but it didn't fit with what, for me, I didn't grow up in a church. I grew up spiritual, but not religious. And so a lot of the things I found were very religious based, which just didn't fit for me. So back then I couldn't find a lot. I feel like now, there's so many more resources for people, like not just because it's the world I'm kind of in, but because I see it in so many other places now. But yeah, back then I didn't feel like I had a lot of support or a lot of things to turn to.
And then, so you went through these trainings to become, you've quite a few certifications behind your name with the
Yeah.
grief work, grief education, the death doula. Can you explain a little bit more about what a death doula does and
Yeah.
how you facilitate that transition?
Yeah. So it's a death doula is, I mean, if you think about it, I think a lot of people are very accustomed to a birth doula.
Yeah.
And it's very similar, just that we're on the other end of life. So we, many times, kind of how I explain it is we're the bridge for people when they get a diagnosis, a terminal diagnosis, and they're on hospice. People have this idea that when they go onto hospice, they're going to have 24/7 care in some manner, and it's actually not the case at all.
Oh.
And a death doula can help be the bridge there, like the support system, not just for the person who is dying and transitioning, but for the family, to help understand like the next steps, what there is to do, how to do it. Like we can help. A lot of times I kind of categorize it into three things. So sometimes we'll be called in right at diagnosis, right when someone is, okay, you're terminal, you have this much time, whether it's hospice usually is 6 months, it can be longer. That, or whether people have waited, like decide not to go on hospice for, until they're closer to their actual end. But a lot of times we'll get called in right away, and we can help from that point with a lot of the planning and the in-between stuff, because hospice provides a nurse, a chaplain, and like care coordination. Sure. But there's a lot of stuff in between that people don't know how to do or what to do. And we kind of come in and say, okay, well, here we can, do you have your plan for your service? Like everything from that to, do you have your passwords all documented in one place? Like, so when you do die, your family can go in and easily close down your accounts and things like that. Do you want to have do we need to organize your photos? Do we need to go through? So we can come in and really help with so many of the parts that you don't think about until you're in that place. Like from, do we need to bring in a cleaner for the home? Do we need to, refer you to a lawyer to help with estates or wills or trusts, things like that. So we can bring in a lot of extra support that people don't know they need until that point.
Yes.
The next part is the 11th hour care. So sometimes we'll be called in when what we call 11th hour, when someone is going to transition to pass within, a few days. And so a lot of times when we're brought in at that point, we're sitting vigil, we're supporting the family, we're supporting the person who's transitioning, whether it's through, just helping the family care, like respite care, sitting with the person, to if there is any last minute planning that needs to be done that hasn't been done yet, to rituals for transitioning, things like that. And then most of the time when we're brought in either two of those, we then usually help with postmortem care. So whether that's helping the family after the person has passed with that transition or ritual, helping with if the people want a home funeral first before the body is moved to wherever they've decided to be, to what they want done with their body. We help a lot with that too, is educating people on knowing their choices for their body and what they want, their choices for how they want to be celebrated and remembered and things like that. And so postmortem care is a lot of that as well. And helping the family. So in so many ways, we're like this bridge that is not known, and people wish they had known about when they hear, like, oh man, my grandfather, a few years ago, I wish we'd had someone like you. It was there was no one guiding us through next steps or what to do next while they were in hospice or in transition. So we really help with a lot of that.
And you allow people to just focus on the person that they're losing and be there for them. You allow them the space and energy because you are taking care of so many other issues that they would normally have to take care of. And you give them that precious time.
Exactly.
So valuable. I'm so curious about, you've probably have been in the last moments of so many people's lives. Do you have any stories you can share, or do you feel like that there is something more beyond this physical life from the experiences that you've had?
Yeah, I don't typically, I follow, even though I'm not a medical professional, I follow HIPAA. So I don't share people's stories unless they've, given me permission or anything like that. But what I can say is the things I've experienced, either just from also my own losses and experiences in life, and then being with people in their time of transition, is there's a lot of unexplainable, things that happen. And there's some great accounts to follow from hospice nurses too, that share a lot, like hospice nurse Julie and hospice nurse Penny share a lot. They're both on social media. They have some great stories, but it's so common for hospice nurses, death doulas, to be there in the time of transition. And one of the ways we know that transition is happening soon is when patients start to talk about, oh, my dad is here. My people who have already passed before them, they start to say, oh, I see them. They're in the corner. They're coming to take me home. Or there's a lot of, reaching up as if someone is there and saying and talking to people that aren't in the room. And that is doesn't happen all the time, but it is common enough that it is talked about a lot. And it's a thread you hear a lot about from hospice workers and death doulas that happens. It's very common. And those are the things that are always hit home for me. Like there's things that are unexplainable that we can chalk up to other things, but when you experience them and see them enough, at least for me, it's given me a sense of like, there's something else that we won't know about until we're at that point. Until we're at that transition ourselves.
For sure. And I'm curious about how so much of your life now revolves around death. What lessons you have pulled that maybe allow you to live more fully, more authentically, because you're on that edge of being around people who are losing someone or they're losing their own life. How do you live more fully as a result of that?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a wonderful question. And my teacher, my main teacher, Alua Arthur, talks about this a lot, how when we really, not just being around death, but even just if we offer ourselves the ability, the curiosity to explore and talk about death more, how it gives us more connection to living life, like however it fulfills each person. And for me, it's just, I've never been around someone who's, you know, dying, who's transitioning and is like, man, I'm so happy. I worked so hard.
Right.
I'm so happy. No, there's never any of that. It's always, I wish I had, you know, forgiven more. I wish I had spent more time doing the things that I loved, that I truly loved, that brought me joy. That's what, which like 99.9% of people say is, I wish I had, you know, cared less about doing what I thought I should do and doing the things that brought me happiness and joy and love, and worried less about trivial things.
In our culture where death is so hidden and put in a separate room far away, sterilized, so many other cultures, it's in the home. It's part of their normal life. All the different ages see it. And there's probably so much that we can learn from this transition that we're hiding away.
I agree. It actually, so I have a funny, not funny, but like interesting fact that so many people just don't know, because it's been like everything you just said, it's been kind of washed out of our sight.
Yeah.
And so I know your fam is back east. So a lot of old homes, especially on the eastern seaboard of the US, have rooms that were referred to as the parlor. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So back then, one of the main reasons for having a parlor room and windows big enough to open was that is where most of the times it was a home funeral parlor. They were parlors for that reason. That's why those rooms were built, was for the transition of the person, to hold home funerals. There were no funeral homes. There was no things like that. The reason the windows are so big in those parlor rooms is so that they could fit the body and the coffins or whatever they were using in and out. And so it used to be a very normalized thing, even in our US culture, because that's how it was brought over here. You know, like there's many different traditions within our country, but you don't see those anymore because we've moved death out of the home, and people don't realize that you can die at home in your own way. You can have home funerals. There's no, I mean, it's different state to state. There are different rules state to state, but most states you can keep the body at home and do a home funeral and rituals, you know, and many, you know, other traditions. They do that. And we don't do that anymore. We think like, even if a person dies at home, we have to, you know, like get the body out of there really quick. And you don't. You can spend time with the person, with your loved one in your home, and do things that I've heard so many stories from some of my teachers too, that it's been such a blessing for the family to know that they can do that and say what they need to say, do the things they need to do with the person, in a loving and kind way, versus it just being like swept out and never seen again.
That is something that I've never thought about. And it's probably something so many of us have never considered, because unless you've really experienced a lot of death around you, you wouldn't even know that you could have this time with the body, or
yeah. And it
how,
used to be such a normal thing because
yeah,
like, just even from that story, like that's why all the old houses have parlors. That's why they were built.
that is crazy.
Yeah.
And another part of what you do is with the grief education, grief work.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
does that look like?
It's, well, a lot of times it's continuing to, work with the family or people around the person who's died, helping them through their grief, just supporting their needs. And then I work a lot with people who maybe I haven't been with them through their person's death, but they just hire me to support their grief process. However long they might need it. So I work a lot with people like that, but also I get people who come and who are like, I have a loved one who's grieving and I'm not sure how to support them. And so I'll give them support, but also education on like, here's how to best support the person who's grieving in your life. So it's kind of, it varies person to person, just like how I'm needed with death doula work varies person and family to family.
Yeah.
The grief education is similar. Whether it's someone who's experienced a similar loss to mine, like a child or a stillbirth, or it's their father who passed suddenly of cancer that came on really quick and it was really, really sudden, or it was a long, drawn out process, or a traumatic, like it's all over the place. And so it's very different person to person on how they're and where they are with their grief.
Mm. And, you've had such a great holistic background of being an amazing yoga teacher, owning your own yoga practice for so many, 15, 20 years that you were a yoga teacher.
Yeah.
Have you pulled in any practices from the Vedic tradition, from the yogi tradition into what you do?
Yeah, there's so much crossover. There's a lot of crossover. I think, if you look at the philosophy of yoga and even just the yamas and the niyamas and how great they are to support someone's either grieving process or, death process, dying process, things like that. They really do. They can be very, very helpful if people are open to them. I think one thing that I'm very conscious of is, if someone's coming to me with a very traditional religious background, but is open to the support of something like this, of not forcing anything on them, and just if they're open to it, I offer things, and if they're not, I just support them where they're at, because there's so many beautiful things from every tradition that can support someone's process in whatever they're coming to me with, but one of my favorite things that one of my teachers does and teaches is a death meditation that is from a Buddhist tradition. And when people are open to that, I love supporting people through that, because it can be very profound and helpful, whether there's death anxiety or you're dealing with the transition of someone in your life or your own grief. And so that's one thing I really love, because I think there's a lot of crossover in yoga and Buddhism. But that Buddhist death meditation is very powerful for people when they're open to it.
And the last few questions for you is, I'm wondering how you practice your own self-care, because you probably can become so emotionally drained in ways that you give so much of yourself. And you're around this process that most of us want to run and hide from. And like I mentioned before, you're running towards it. How do you fill up your own cup, and what do you do for your own self-care?
I spend a lot of time in nature. That is helpful for me. Moving my body is helpful. I'm in, not just support groups, but like groups with other death doulas, other grief educators to to just be in and talk about like, oh, I had this, I'm having, like ask questions, support each other, things like that, is really helpful. I don't take on a lot of this work full time either.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
I've found that doing death doula work and grief work full time is too much for me. And because I have other life circumstances too. I have a son that has a medical disability and requires a lot. And so
Mm-hmm.
I have other work that helps me be creative too.
Sure. Yeah.
Like I work for a staging company. I have a background in interior design also. And
Ah,
instead of having to I don't have to work in interior design full time, but I can go in and help stage a house, and it's creative and it's fun and I'm moving. And so finding other areas of not just work, but that like feed me in the other aspects of my life that I need is helpful, and that don't require also a lot of mental and emotional work.
yes. Yes. You're using
Is
different parts of your capacity. Yeah.
Yeah, is so helpful, because I think what I've seen with a lot, and this is not just like in this work, but like even in yoga and my years and years in that, is people get so into it that then they think they need to make it like their whole life
Mm-hmm.
and a whole career out of it. And I found that I'm a much better death doula and grief educator when it's not my full-time thing, when I'm able to also express and tap into other aspects of things that I love.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, and I can give so much more to the clients I do take on.
Yes. Yep.
And it feels so much more fulfilling in that way to me, because I know I can give them what they need, and I have other ways to fill my cup, whether it's, doing, the staging job and some other things, and still teaching yoga occasionally, and having kind of like a fluid dynamic life. And that's how I found that helpful. Like it doesn't need to be all or nothing.
Yes.
And that's also what brings me to kind of almost circle back to one of your questions of that's what brings me joy. There's so much creative side to me, and having things that fulfill that is so important to my joy and my life and my happiness too. And one of the self-care things too is just being with my dogs, being with my son, going to concerts, doing things that are just bring life to me.
Yes.
And I think for people is finding that and just doing more of that. You don't need to make something you love your whole life, but you just need to make room for it so that your life is more you, I guess.
That completely makes sense. And my last question for you was, what does a fulfilled life mean to you? And you probably have just answered that completely.
Yeah.
Because that really does sound like you are living this completely fulfilled life by entertaining all these different aspects of what a good life is to you, with nature and people, your son, your family, your creative work.
Yeah.
And then
mm-hmm. For me, it's just letting myself be in that dynamic place that I am. We're all such dynamic, unique people, humans, and knowing that, and not knowing what brings me happiness and joy, and doing more of that and prioritizing that, while also like, yeah, prioritizing sleep and rest and health is good, but also like for me, travel, and like
Mm-hmm.
planning that stuff and making certain things non-negotiable. And like I'm planning a trip to the south of France with some girlfriends next summer for an adult women's summer camp in the south of France that I
Oh,
found. And I'm like, do I like prioritizing things like that just, I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to go do that. And how do I make that happen? Is important for, I think, for all of us. And even if it doesn't even have to be something like that big, it's like, oh, there's these free things in the park near me every few weeks. I just need to prioritize that because it's so fun and it brings me joy, and community is important. And maybe if it's not that for you, finding the things that are that.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so for so many people in our culture, that those things get pushed aside because you feel like you have to work this full-time job to get the health insurance. And then
Mm-hmm.
you might have a family and you have all these household responsibilities. Joy gets pushed out. Your creative side gets pushed out. Your own health and well-being get pushed out. How can people who maybe don't have much capacity right now, or maybe even have like their own illness, how can they bring
Mm,
in little bits of joy to their lives right now where they are?
yeah. I think it's real for me when I've been in those places, because I feel like so many of us are in those places a lot. And life circumstances, can do that, where we're like, I can't even go do this other thing, because by the time I'm home, I'm exhausted. And so I think it's just even finding the little pockets, like,
Yeah.
of it. Like, okay, I have, 10 minutes and I'm gonna put on my favorite songs and just listen to my favorite songs.
Mm.
It's like those little things, like we all, because, oh, and I have it written down for some of my other grief teachers. Um, when we talk about like accessibility to certain things, because a lot of times certain things aren't accessible. And so it's finding the little ways that things are accessible. Like this music brings me joy. Okay, that is something I can access easily every day. Can I add that in every day? This TV show, this certain, food,
Yeah.
like enjoying, like, I think about how at also like the end of life, people are like, God, I wish I'd just eaten dessert more. I wish I had just let myself enjoy certain things more. And I think it's finding, like finding those little things too. Like, yeah, you know what? I could go tomorrow. I will be much happier if I know I'm going and I ate those peanut butter cups that were
Yes.
just sitting in my cupboard that I was like, I can't eat those right now.
Yeah. Oh, I
Um,
love that.
those
And
little, like, we can find those little things every day. And it's just seeing like what is accessible to me, even if circumstances aren't allowing me the big things, but I can find the little things every day.
I go on a little nature walk across the street from my house. There's just a little open space area. And that half hour, 45 minutes, whenever, I walk my dog, it is like the most soul filling time of just being out in this nature and noticing the way things look different every day. And it sounds so, I don't know, not exciting, but it is the most life giving thing that I do. Just that
Mm-hmm.
little nature walk. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will plug all the ways that people can get in touch with you, either if they're listening through the podcast or through YouTube, down below, your website, your social media. And just thank you so much for spending your morning with me and
Yeah.
sharing about everything that you do as a death